Hey, this is Mr. Math Guy. So for the do now today, we really want to look at the most efficient method possible for solving each of them. So we're solving algebraically 1, 2, and 3. The three methods we could use: factoring, completing the square, and quadratic formula. You can only use each method once. So if you use number 1, if you use the quadratic formula for number 1, you can only use the quadratic formula for number 1. You can't use it for 2 and 3. And so make sure you use, if it's factorable, make sure you factor it. Make sure you choose the correct one for each of them. And if you find one way is not working, maybe try a different way. And make sure you really try the most efficient method possible. So you kind of got to think about the question and be like, okay, which one do I think is going to work here? Factoring is usually the easiest if you can factor. But then look at the numbers in the equation. Think, okay, is this quadratic formula would be easier, or would it be completing the square? So go ahead, do 1, 2, and 3. Make sure you explain why after you're done, why you chose your method. And pause the video and play it once you're done. So number one's factorable. So if you get this factorable, I think that's usually the easiest way of doing it. You could not factor 2 and 3. You can only factor number 1. So number 1, solve by factoring, and that's because it was factorable. Now number 2 and 3, you could use the quadratic formula for either of these. You can use completing the square for either of these. But what makes 2 easier than 3 for using completing the square? It doesn't have a Lie coefficient is 1, and that b value, the coefficient on x, is even. So when I do the whole b divided by 2 thing, I'm going to get a nice integer value. I'm not going to get a non-integer. I'm not going to get a fraction. And then when you look at 3, why did I choose quadratic formula there? Lie coefficient is 2. That's good enough to say, let's use a quadratic formula. Also, the b value is a odd number, making it a little bit more difficult to use completely the square. You definitely could completely square number 3. It just would be a lot more steps and a lot more room for mistakes. So that's what I got for the do now. Let's go to the next page. On the next page, and this is just, I think this is the last page before the classwork. We're just putting some word problems to the quadratic equations. So what I want you guys to do really is just do the first one and do the second one. Pause the video, play it once you're done, and I'll show you the answer and explain a little bit. So here's what I got for the first one. You also could have done, if you wanted to, your work would just look different than mine. You would get the same answer. You could have done L is equal to 2W. I think most people actually do that. And solve it from there. We should get the same exact answer. You find the width right off the bat, and it makes it a little bit easier. So what that would be, 2W times W equals 34. And you get 2W squared equals 34. W squared equals 17. Square root 17 would be rounded to the nearest tenth, 4.1. So you could have done that too. Actually, now looking at it, that's way easier than what I did, because you get W right off the bat. And that last one, this was actually factorable, and I think most students tend to do the completing the square method for this one, because, and honestly, completing the square method, I actually think it's a little bit easier, because we're trying to get two numbers that add to 40, but multiply to negative 6,000. So that's a large number to multiply to. It's difficult to see those two numbers. So if you just did completing the square, it would have made it a lot easier. I think it actually would have made it a lot better. But you could also factor it, and you get 60 and negative 100, but why do I cancel out negative 100? Well, you can't have a negative amount of yards. So that is a rejection. So the only width we can have is 60. And then we just got to plug that back into our equation. To either of them, I'm going to plug it back into the bottom one. So 60 plus 40 gets you 100 for the length. So that's it. The rest of the classwork is homework.